Hey ho, it's Kathy Beal of Empowerment Unlimited with a look at what's going on with the astrology of the Roe versus Wade decision. And I am starting with the chart of when the decision came down, and I want to point out the ascendant. This is the face to the world. 29 Pisces is the last degree of the zodiac. It is the degree of ultimate sorrow, and it's the degree that was rising when the Afghan war started. So that is an indicator of how long there would be suffering, fighting, not entire happiness about this decision. The moon in the sixth house in Virgo is an indicator that this is, in fact, about women's bodies, women's health. Virgo is a sign of health and healing. The moon represents women, and it's falling in the house of health, bodies, healing. And the moon is in a trine to Jupiter and Mercury up there in the 11th. Jupiter expanding things, Mercury in Capricorn, both solidifying something institutionally. That would be the opinion, Mercury in Capricorn, and the expansive benefits that it had or brought. That Jupiter-Mercury conjunction was trine Uranus, planet of the unexpected, the awakener, the liberator. And this, in fact, did have a huge impact on the lives of women and opened them to us to a much freer way of living. Other important points in this. All right, I want to draw attention to Pluto in Libra on the doorway to the seventh house, house of partners. Libra is the sign of the courts, the sign of social matters, and also relationships. And Pluto being right there really did have a marker for a change, a complete evolution in the balance of power and in how relationships were going to go by giving women something that they didn't have. Now, a marker of all of these charts, here's the first of many that we're going to see: opposition. And opposition has two influences at loggerheads with each other, and they're not comfortable. It's kind of, it seesaws or ping pongs back and forth. Mars, action, men, the court. It was an all-male court at that time in the house, ninth house of the courts and policy, public policy. In the sign of Sagittarius, also public policy, in a really tight opposition to Saturn, society, the rules, the status quo, in Gemini in the house of communication. And it was actually in a wide, but I'm going to count it, T-square to that moon. A T-square is a dynamic configuration that has stressors demanding action from two different directions. So that Mars is squaring that moon and the Saturn is squaring that moon, and the pressure point is on women. And something had to change. Something had to shift from this. Let me see if I'm missing anything in this little lineup. Okay, so we're just chugging through this. Let's see how this fits in with the US chart. And for this purpose, I am using the most commonly used chart for the day of the Declaration of Independence. I am not getting into an argument over which chart is right. I will say that this one has been used so much that it has energy and applicability. First thing I want to point out with this is that moon in the Roe chart in Virgo up there in the ninth house of policy and law and worldview. is right on top of the US Neptune in Virgo. Now, that Neptune in Virgo is in play very much at this moment and was also at the time of the Civil War, which might have some meaning to a few of you. The moon conjunct that Neptune imbued this decision with maybe empathy, compassion, a higher view of things, but also religion, absolutely baked into this. I will tell you, I was in law school after this decision came out. And at that point, and for a few years into the late 70s, there wasn't a religious component. In fact, there wasn't really even a huge outcry about women having privacy rights, which, by the way, that Pluto in Libra in the Roe v. Wade chart certainly does indicate privacy rights. It wasn't for a few years that for the right-wing groups to decide to put abortion into the center of, or call themselves pro-life. They moved on from, if you can look this up, a segregationalist approach, and then made pro-life issues, aka anti-abortion, their cause. So some people will say that Neptune in Virgo in the ninth is also an indicator of racism. Just throwing that out there. Now, if there is a religious bent to this, though, I want to point out that this is all in a really nice relationship with the US Pluto, which is at 27 Capricorn in the second house. So everything comes down to money and institutions. It keeps coming back to that. Second house is money, resources, and that the Roe v. Wade moon is moving into a really easy flow of a trine. So at the time, it was an evolutionary push that seemed absolutely organic. However, do note that this moon squares the US Mars. So there was something in here. It wasn't just going to trundle along. It would be challenged and challenged and challenged. And until recently, the challenges didn't get anywhere. Other things to note in this, that opposition that I mentioned, the Mars-Saturn opposition, falls exactly across the first seventh axis of the Declaration of Independence chart. So the not being able to find the point of balance is a big relational issue here. Identity versus where's the control. The seventh house is the house of partners and allies, but also open enemies. So turning the government into the enemy out of all this could be. Do note that I mentioned earlier that the Mars-Saturn opposition creates a T-square to that moon up there in the ninth. So there was pressure at the moment that this decision was reached to change the role of women, or to act on. Act on is a better way of looking at it. Act on the role of women and women's bodies through the courts, the ninth house. Notice that the Roe v. Wade Saturn at 14 Gemini is exactly trine the US Saturn at 14 Libra. So that's kind of stabilizing. It stabilized policy. It set out the philosophy, the way of thinking. The courts came through to do this. And I want to point out that last year, transiting Saturn was exactly at 14 Aquarius, making a grand trine, an easy flow of energy from those going through those 3 points. And I had thought at the time that this could portend stabilization and protection, but Saturn also means delays and obstacles and constriction, which appears to be the way this is heading. Every time there's a grand trine, you always look for a planet that is halfway between 2 of the points, because otherwise the energy just flows and flows and flows in a kind of insane way. And the sextile point, the kite, the string of the kite is Mars in Sagittarius. So there was a way of looking at this that was a legislative or taking action in a way that made law, which in fact it did, to bring this into effect. And the way it played out last year when the grand trine hit was, and this grand trine has occurred before, all right? Saturn was at this point in the 90s. I haven't looked to be exact. That's when Planned Parenthood v. Casey was in effect, which I know reaffirmed it in the early 90s. This grand trine with Mars being the kite would represent all the different states last year kind of going into overdrive to pass laws and bring them up, to try to get them up before the court again. Other things I want to point out. All right, the Venus in the Roe v. Wade chart at 13 Capricorn is, what did I say about oppositions? Exactly opposite the US sun. So there was something here about women and rules and foundations and the physicality of it, family interests, and what happens with this. It made a T-square to the US Saturn in Libra, requiring or putting pressure on the courts to balance out this ping-ponging back and forth between women and families. And the court, in the sign of balance, in fact, crafted an opinion that used the word balance, balancing the right of the woman and gestational issues, and trying to set guidelines and boundaries based on a balance of considerations. Other things I want you to know about. This is a lot of it. Oh, also the Roe v. Wade moon, representing women, women's bodies, their health, their privacy, is an adjustment aspect to the US moon, which represents the people. So this was, shifting the way things were done. It was, however, and is, however, in a sextile or an opportunity aspect to the US Mercury in Cancer. So again, when it was released, this was not a hotly contested, people in the streets, firebombing stuff kind of decision. It was several years before the pro-life aspect of this suddenly came into the line of sight. I also want to point out another opposition involving Neptune. Keep Neptune in mind. Neptune's an issue. An opposition here involving Neptune in Sagittarius and the US Uranus. So that is, as they say, baked in for agitation, for something shaking things up. Definitely this opinion did shake up the way things were done in this country at that point, but it also carried with it the discomfort and the, well, that's kind of like the seed for religious complaints coming out about it. And while we're in opposition land, let's just throw in that there's an opposition between Jupiter in Capricorn in the Roe chart and the US Mercury in Cancer. So thinking the emotionality of it, and there's a push-pull here between really long-term, cold, calculating, non-emotional ways of looking at things, and the emotionality of the issue represented by that Mercury. And in a distant way, the Roe Mercury is also part of that. And do note that the Jupiter and Mercury in the Roe chart exactly on top of the US Pluto, transforming our institutions, transforming our values in a way. Another inconjunct, the Sun in the Roe chart is in an inconjunct with Venus and also Jupiter. So it's an adjustment in the role of women in the families, the role of nurturing. There's probably a whole lot more in here. I don't know if I mentioned in the earlier chart, but the Sun in the Roe chart, let's just point it out. The Sun in the Roe chart is in a nice trine to Pluto. So again, this was an organic, almost like evolutionary matter of fact. Yeah, that's what's supposed to be. And both of those bodies are in a sextile to Neptune. So it made sense. It was easy from a policy perspective for this to come into existence. So I want to look now at what was going on in February when the first, the Alito draft was actually handed. I understand this was when it was released within the court on February 9th. The date is not coincidental because it was exactly on the US Pluto return. See, Pluto at 27 Capricorn, conjunct Mercury at the time at 26 Capricorn. So a revision, a complete redoing, transformation of right on top of the Roe Mercury, and by extension, the Jupiter is part of it. So a complete revision of what the message was of the language, the Mercury in Capricorn, complete revision of the language in the Roe v. Wade opinion. There is no surprise, an opposition, the moon, and a contact between the moon and Neptune. Yet again, the moon, the Roe v. Wade moon in the 6th house of health, in the sign of health, women's bodies, opposite Neptune in Pisces in the 12th house. There is, this says, a religious standoff. This is not just a political decision. There is in the background a religious piece to that, and it is making, both of those are squaring Mars in Sagittarius, in the sign Sagittarius, having to do with policy, with law, Mars being men, action, 9th house of the courts. And oh, look, here's another opposition. Mars in the Roe chart is exactly opposite the moon in the first draft chart. Lots going on here. So let's look. Moon opposite Mars, women, thinking about women, that's Gemini, thoughts about women, information about people at loggerheads with an active worldview, active philosophical approach. And yet each of these points, you'll notice it's like this big X, each of these points is squaring the point next to it. This is a configuration called a grand cross. So the Roe moon is squaring the Roe Mars, which is squaring Neptune at the time of the first draft's release, which is squaring the moon at the time of the first draft's release, which is squaring the moon in the Roe chart. A grand cross pulls the energy in 4 directions. There isn't really a point of resolution in this. It is more a suspension over a situation, looking at things. It's much like the Hanged Man in the tarot. And so this wasn't that fits. This was not the final decision. It wasn't releasing the decision exactly at that point. Other things to look at, the Venus, transiting Venus, was exactly on Venus in the Roe chart. So Roe v. Wade was having its Venus return, and this time it was with Mars conjunct. So a combined effort revisiting it, going on it. And this was coming out of a really long Venus retrograde that happened in the months before this. And conjunct the North Node in Capricorn. So one way of looking at this is that it was predestined in some way, or although I honestly, I don't think it had to go in the direction that this draft went, but this is the indicator of men and women coming together, bring a lot of force to the values and the statement and the public face, and the way of putting it, of that Venus in the 10th house, the public house. Interestingly, this configuration, Venus in the Roe chart, and then the Venus-Mars conjunction in the transit chart of February 10, had just completed a trine to Uranus in the 2nd house. So there was a shock, a different way of looking at things, an unlocking, maybe what you can think of it as breaking. Uranus was in the sign of Taurus, which does represent bodies, in the house of values and in money. Money may be a factor and issue in this. It's possible. Other things to keep in mind, I had mentioned that the transiting Mercury and Pluto were on top of the Roe v. Wade Mercury and Jupiter, which means that transiting Pluto was squaring. All of this is squaring Uranus in Libra in the 7th house. So there was a radical act, a radical break, and some might say liberating, an epiphany, something that was not the way it was. And the sun on that day at 21 Aquarius in the 12th house of things going on behind the scenes was in a trine to that Uranus. So we had a demand for action, something kind of popping things open, and then it was an easy, again, and organic way to get going on some massive changes. Going back again to what was going on, to the Mercury and Pluto of the February 10 transits on the Roe v. Wade Mercury, note that that was all trine the current position of the nodes. So there is something evolutionary and ultimately pushing toward the future in everything that has been going on. Hold on. Also, so looking specifically at the transiting moon on top of that, Saturn in a trine to transiting Saturn. I do not believe there was much of an argument to get a majority on this draft. It just looks like it was an kind of effortless flowing things. One other comment I want to make about this moon Neptune opposition is, remember that when Roe v. Wade was issued, the moon was on top of the US Neptune, and now it is opposite the US Neptune. So something has evolved, something has changed, and Neptune, where it's hanging out now, is at a measuring point from where it was in the early 70s, and it's also around where it was just before the Civil War started. And I do believe that we have a war of worldview going on here. All right, one other thing I want you to look at with me. All right, this is a chart for the leaking of the draft, which happened on May 2nd in the evening. I did not catch this time. I got it from a colleague of mine named Michelle Young. Number of things I want to point out. Let's start with the 29-degree ascendant, 29-degree Pisces ascendant. In the days just before this was released, Venus, ruler of women in the sign of Pisces, Venus had crossed over that. So Venus had met with Neptune, had met with Jupiter, and then crossed over that, making this very, very much, you might think, okay, Venus in Pisces is said to be exalted, and there is a sacrificial feel, or also an all-consuming, all-connecting feel to Venus at 29 Pisces. This could indicate a tremendous number of people being affected. It could indicate a tremendous number of people coming together, being connected. It could indicate the sacrifice of a tremendous number of people. But at the time that this leak came out, Venus had moved into Aries, notable for many reasons. Aries is not what is normally considered to be a comfy place for Venus. Venus, ruler of Libra, relationships, and Taurus. I want to taste it, touch it, feel it, smell it, consume it. Venus in Aries is much more assertive and aggressive than feminine receptive energy is said to want. This is warrior mode. This is Xena, Wonder Woman, Diana, Artemis, I'm coming to get you. And it is in an opposition, yes, another opposition with that Pluto in Libra in the 7th house. This is pitting women, fighter women, against huge power. This is causing tension between women and the restructuring of social ground rules, of power dynamics and the relationship rules. As soon as this decision was leaked, people started showing up at the Supreme Court that night, and going to the streets has only continued. And here is where that is likely to, what that's likely to lead to. So Jupiter has left Pisces and has moved into Aries. And that happened on the 10th, the day before I recorded this. Jupiter will be in Aries, only going to about 8 degrees Aries, so it's only going to go about just a little bit into it, and then it will duck back into Pisces in the fall. But the important things to know are that Jupiter is in Aries until the end of October. Just before the midterms. And later this month, Mars up here in Pisces, in the leak chart, Mars will also move into Aries. So towards the end of the month, we're going to have The ruler of the ruler of Aries in Aries, along with Jupiter, really ramping things up. And each time a planet moves into Aries, it's going to have an opposition with that Pluto in Libra over there in the seventh house of partners, allies, open enemies. So Jupiter is going to oppose it. Jupiter will actually oppose it 3 times. It'll oppose it in the next few weeks. And then when it retrogrades later this summer, it'll go over it again. And then when it finally pushes its way into and out of this it'll go back into Pisces briefly, and then early next year it'll go back into Aries again. Okay, so have I completely confused you with that? Meanwhile, Mars, Lord of War, is going to have a standoff with Pluto, Lord of Death. This is a real, so the fight is going to go on. It will go on. It will go on into the midterms. It will go on past the midterms. It will go on into next year. There are a number of indicators indicate that whatever is going on right now is not the end of the story. Before I get to that, let's look at what's going on here in the 12th house. All this activity in the 12th house of things that are hidden behind the scenes, stuff that is covert, things that cannot be seen by the rest of us. First off, Saturn in Aquarius, the restrictions coming out of this behind the scenes, squaring the node. Okay, so something happening about values, pushing against values, blowing up values. Saturn likes old ways. If you've read any of that draft opinion, you might have been struck by the fact that somebody from hundreds of years ago is cited as an expert. From hundreds of years ago, who prosecuted women as witches and burned them, cited as an expert. But let's look at what else. All right, so we have in the 12th house of things that are behind the scenes and we cannot see. Mars, action. Neptune could be beliefs, ideology. Neptune and Jupiter together, they're coming off the conjunction that they had in the middle of April. So there could be people behind this decision who absolutely believe from an ideological perspective that it is what had to happen. And it's in an all those guys are in an opportunity aspect to the North Node in Taurus, and they're in a sextile to, let's set Mars aside for a second. Neptune and Pisces are in a sextile to that Pluto. So there was an opening there to put belief systems, maybe gaslighting, maybe, I don't know. I mean, there are people who are questioning the mental faculties of the author of that draft, and this would be consistent with that. But I also want to point out that the Mars in Pisces is the really interesting piece of this. It is exactly sextile the Venus. So somebody saw a way of, in a real backhanded way, bringing this, affecting women's rights. Now, I'd say that Mars in Pisces in the 12th indicates the leak, because it's in a sextile to Uranus in the second house. So this shocking thing comes out. I am not aware, I mean, it might have happened before, but I am not aware in my decades of being a lawyer of a Supreme Court draft actually leaking to the press. And the configuration here has a lot of confusion about who actually did it. And I have read arguments for it came from a clerk from a liberal judge, and incredible arguments for it came from the conservative wing for a variety of reasons. One theory being that there's precedent for a judge changing his vote at the last minute, which apparently Justice Roberts did before they were ruling on the Affordable Care Act, and that this might have been a way to pull people back into line who might have been wavering. But regardless, there's this shocking leak, this unprecedented leak, very Uranian leak in a real backhanded way. And it is this Mars is also in a square to Mars in the 9th house. So there's some kind of indirect backhanded thing that maybe pushed something forward. We don't even quite know what is going on with this or what will happen. A few other things in the chart. The promise of the February 10 draft has actually been achieved by this date of May 2nd, because Pluto at that point was sitting right on top of the Roe v. Wade Mercury. I have a number of things to say about the role of Mercury in all of this. Now, Mercury in Capricorn, institutional, making long-term, that's the draft, that's that's the ruling, a ruling that has been in place for 50 years. It has been durable. It has stood the test of time. And then Pluto, the lord of the underworld, like everyone's worst case scenario on all sides, coming and completely roto-rootering it. But is this the end of the story? Well, here's why I think a lot more is going on. Just in the days before this, Mercury in the transit chart, in the May 2nd chart, had already moved into Gemini. But in the days before, while it was still in Taurus, Mercury in Taurus, and this happened this was around the 30th or so of, just before the 30th of April, because it was right before the solar eclipse in Taurus. So that Mercury trined Pluto and the Roe Pluto, and it's going to make that trine 3 times. A Mercury-Pluto trine will dredge up secrets. It will have revelations. There'll be things about power. There'll be stuff about, I don't know if there's any money or corruption. We're involving the 2nd house. It was in Taurus. That is likely to be a massive issue. Last night, when the debate, when senators were speaking on the floor of the Senate about the legislation that's being voted on as I record this, Sheldon Whitehouse made a big deal about the role of dark money in the court and indications that this particular decision had been bankrolled. I didn't say it, he did. And I would say that Mercury making 3 trines to, transiting Mercury in Taurus, making 3 trines to that Pluto and 3 trines to the Roe Mercury, says a lot more is going on here. Now, let's add to that. How is it making 3 trines? Well, it's because currently Mercury is now retrograde. It has, at the time of the decision, it was at 2 degrees Gemini in the house of values. And yesterday on the 10th, at the same time as, on the same day that Jupiter moved into Aries and upped the fire, Mercury stationed retrograde is about 4 Gemini. So in a couple of weeks, it is going to go back into Taurus, and then it's going to make another trine to transiting Pluto and to Mercury in the Roe v. Wade chart. Then it will go direct. It will make a third trine at the beginning of June. Then around June 3rd, after June 3rd, it stations direct. Then it will make a third trine to that Pluto and the Roe Mercury, and then it will scoot back into Gemini. And then in the middle of June, it will return to the degree that it occupied on the date of this leak, 2 degrees Gemini. So it is very possible that the middle of June is when this decision comes out, and all of this Mercury Pluto trining going on, and the fact that a Mercury retrograde dredges stuff up, not out of the realm of possibility that there will be actual revelations about the role of money, not out of the realm of possibility that somebody will change his vote. I'm not holding my breath, but astrologically, it is something that is possible. A few other things. There is an opposition. Oh, big surprise, involving, you're not going to believe this, the moon and Neptune yet again. The moon in the leak chart at 6 degrees Gemini, opposite the Roe v. Wade Neptune at 6 Sagittarius. And again, we have loggerheads about beliefs, beliefs, values, the role of women, and a tension with religiosity. Notice that Neptune is it's really close to the 9th house cusp. So it's straddling the house of other people's money and philosophy, worldview, ideology. So there could be a tremendous amount of talk coming out of this about the role of money and religion. And you don't have to look too far to be seeing a lot of investigation and yakking going on online about a man, a very leading, very wealthy Catholic who's been extremely involved in the particular individuals who have been pushed forward as justices. Let's see. There's one other thing in this that I want to, let's talk about what the eclipses are doing. Okay. So we currently have eclipses in the signs of Taurus and Scorpio. This is the money axis. This is the resource axis. This is the axis that deals with power and control, who controls, who's controlling, issues of huge money, of autocracy, and again, privacy would be a Scorpio issue here. The April 30th new moon happened right on the doorway. It was at 10 Taurus, and it was right on the doorway of, there we go, right on the doorway between the first house of identity and the second house of resources, money, talents. And it was conjunct Uranus. So there was a real startling, something, big whopper coming out. And this opinion is part of the fallout, the, oh my God, wham, whiplash news coming off of that eclipse. There is a lunar eclipse on the 15th or 16th, depending on where you are in the world, at, let's just say 25 Scorpio, falling in the 8th house, and it's squaring that Mars in Aquarius in the 12th house of behind the scenes with the transits. Well, it's in the Roe v. Wade chart. So this next lunar eclipse is actually going to form a T-square against that Saturn, because when there's a lunar eclipse, that means it's a full moon, which means that the sun and moon are opposite each other. So they will be opposite, and each of them will be pushing equally on that Saturn, and big issues of money, power, control are going to be set in motion because of this eclipse. Lunar eclipses always bring revelations, and I'll just say there is an active push among some members of the Senate to revisit the lack of vetting of one of the new justices, Brett Kavanaugh, and to look at the role of dark money, and actually speaking in terms of some of these justices being purchased, which is shocking in open language to be using. But that's what's going on up there. And this, so just, it may not completely come to light this month, but it's an issue that will play out again and again and again. So how does all of this, what does all of this amount to? Well, okay, again, big religious and ideological issues involved here. The actual opinion may or may not, probably will, but it's not given, completely eviscerate Roe v. Wade. If it sends it to the states, there are 26 states that are poised to have the most restrictive legislation that you could possibly imagine, and worse. And but a couple of things. All right, so it's likely that the decision comes out in mid-June, given what Mercury is doing. It is probable that between now and mid-June, a lot more information comes out about the role of money, the role of values, not just because of Mercury's retrograde and its ongoing trines to Pluto and the Roe Mercury, but also because Venus, as she moves through Aries, is going to square Pluto transiting. It's going to square the 28 Capricorn position. So it's going to square Mercury in the Roe chart. It's going to square transiting Pluto. Something's got to give when that happens. There could be some very, very angry things that happen at that point. And the 11th house also represents Congress. So who knows what happens at that. Fighting will continue. If worst case scenario, actually one way or another, there will continue to be fighting, arguing, at least until the midterms, and then more stuff happening next year after Jupiter goes back into Aries and then proceeds to oppose. It's going to do a bunch of things as it goes back into Aries. It will square that Pluto. It will trine Neptune. That could bring all kinds of stuff to light. It will square Venus, which squares demand action. It will trine that Mars, so the legislative fight could be huge and maybe even get somewhere early next year. Then it will square the North Node. Hey, we're moving into the future. And then it'll square these two, the Mercury and Jupiter in the Roe chart. And then the final bit, once it moves into Taurus next year, it'll square the US sun, so, which will push for action if it hasn't happened by then. So long-term prognosis out of all this is that there's a tremendous amount of energy built into all of this to force federal legislation. So if it does not come now, which does not seem likely, don't freak out. Keep breathing, keep breathing, keep breathing. And for those of you who don't know me, I have forecasts freely and regularly available at empowermentunlimited.net. I have forecasts for every month, every full and new moon, every week. And all of these are double posted also on this YouTube channel, Professional Aquarian. I have a lot of stuff on Facebook and Empowerment Unlimited, and I have a group, the Astro Insight Lounge, that actually discusses political things, and a Patreon, patreon.com/Kathy Beal, with an awful lot of bonus content. If you like this, please hit the like button, share it, subscribe. Keep breathing. We are in this for the long haul.